18 candles had barely flickered out on her cheap supermarket birthday cake when the front door locked behind her. Rain lashed against the porch. No money, no family, just a trash bag of clothes and her late father's cryptic map leading into the unforgiving depths of the Cascade Mountains. Rain cascaded from the gutters of the modest suburban house in Oak Haven, Washington, pooling on the cracked driveway where Maeve Gallagher stood shivering. It was exactly 12:01 a.m. on October 14th, the day she legally became an adult. Inside the warm, softly lit living room, Richard Harding stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. Her stepfather had been counting down the days to this moment with the cold, calculated patience of a predator. Beside him sat Diane, Maeve's mother, staring blankly at the muted television screen. Diane hadn't said a word when Richard handed Maeve a heavy-duty trash bag containing her jeans, a few sweaters and a pair of worn boots. She hadn't intervened when Richard declared that since Maeve was now 18, she owed a retroactive 6 months of rent, and failing to pay meant immediate eviction. Maeve had no money. Richard had systematically ensured that. Every paycheck she had earned waiting tables at the Oak Haven diner over the summer had been confiscated under the guise of contributing to the household. Standing in the freezing downpour, Maeve stared at the brass house numbers. 402. This had been her prison for 8 years, ever since her biological father, Thomas Gallagher, vanished without a trace, leaving Diane vulnerable to Richard's manipulative charm. The police had ruled Thomas's disappearance a suicide, pointing to his mounting debts and erratic behavior, but Maeve had never believed it. Thomas loved her too much to leave her. Clutching the plastic bag to her chest to keep her meager belongings dry, Maeve turned away from the house. She had no friends to call. Richard had isolated her, deeming anyone she brought home a bad influence until people simply stopped trying to be her friend. She had no car. She had only one possession of true value, a weathered, leather-bound journal that had belonged to Thomas. She had kept it hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, grabbing it just seconds before Richard marched her to the front door. Maeve walked toward the edge of town, her sneakers sinking into the muddy shoulders of Route 9. The streetlights grew sparse, eventually surrendering entirely to the oppressive blackness of the dense Washington timberland. The temperature was dropping fast. The weather forecast had warned of an early freeze, and the icy needles of rain biting into her cheeks confirmed it. She needed shelter, and the town's single homeless shelter was 10 miles in the opposite direction, currently operating at full capacity. But Maeve had a destination in mind. For years, she had obsessively studied the sketches and coordinates scribbled in the back pages of Thomas's journal. He used to tell her bedtime stories about a secret fortress in the woods, a place he called the Rookery, nestled deep within the craggy ravines of Blackwood Ridge. She had always thought it was a fairy tale, a fantasy concocted by a father to entertain his 10-year-old daughter. But in his final journal entries, the fairy tale morphed into frantic, paranoid directions. Follow the rusted iron bridge over the gorge. Look for the twin pines scarred by lightning. Walk 300 paces north by northwest. With the beam of a cheap plastic flashlight cutting through the sheets of rain, Maeve left the asphalt and stepped into the tree line. The forest swallowed her instantly. The canopy above was so thick that the rain fell in heavy, concentrated globs rather than a mist. Briars tore at her jeans, and the uneven, root-choked ground threatened to twist her ankles with every step. Hours bled into one another. Her legs burned, her lungs ached from the frigid air, and her fingers were so numb she could barely maintain her grip on the flashlight. Doubt began to creep in, insidious and cold. What if she was chasing a ghost? What if Thomas really was crazy, and these directions led to nothing but a frozen grave in the wilderness? She imagined Richard waking up in his warm bed, pouring a cup of hot coffee, secure in the knowledge that the problematic stepdaughter was finally out of his hair, perhaps permanently. That thought fueled her. Anger became a furnace in her chest. She refused to die in the mud. Just as the pitch-black sky began to soften into a bruised charcoal grey, her flashlight beam caught something metallic, a rusted iron bridge, ancient and overgrown with ivy, spanning a rushing gorge. Maeve gasped, a ragged sound of relief tearing from her throat. She crossed the bridge, the metal groaning under her weight. On the other side, she found the twin pines, their trunks black and split by old lightning strikes. She pulled out the compass her father had given her for her 9th birthday and set her bearing. North by northwest, 300 paces. She counted out loud, her voice a raspy whisper in the vast silence of the woods. 298, 299, 300. She stopped. Before her was a dense thicket of blackberry bushes, towering 8 feet high. Nothing else. Tears of absolute exhaustion finally spilled over her freezing cheeks. She dropped her trash bag and sank to her knees in the wet ferns. It was a lie, a delusion. But as she fell forward, her hand brushed against something hard and unnatural, hidden beneath the thick layer of pine needles and brambles. It wasn't stone. It was treated wood. Maeve frantically wiped her eyes and grabbed a heavy fallen branch, using it to beat back the thorny vines. Slowly, a structure revealed itself. It was built directly into the side of a steep, rocky embankment, camouflaged flawlessly by decades of overgrowth, moss, and decaying timber. The roof sagged under the weight of accumulated forest debris, and the single visible window was caked in impenetrable grime. It looked like a stiff breeze would reduce it to splinters. It was an old, forgotten cabin, and it was exactly where her father said it would be. Maeve dragged her bag onto the narrow, rotting porch. The front door was made of thick, weathered oak, swollen from years of dampness. There was no visible doorknob, just a heavy iron latch and a heavy-duty padlock hanging open, rusted permanently into its shackle. She leaned her entire body weight against the wood. It didn't budge. She stepped back, took a deep breath, and rammed her shoulder into the door. With a horrific screech of rusted hinges, the door gave way, sending Maeve stumbling into the pitch-black interior. The air inside was stale, smelling of dry dust and old pine, but crucially, it was dry. The roof, despite its sagging exterior, was completely intact. Maeve clicked on her dying flashlight and swept the beam across the room. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The exterior of the cabin was a masterclass in deception. Inside, it was a fortress. The rotting wood she had seen outside was merely a facade bolted over reinforced steel beams. The walls were lined with thick, industrial-grade insulation. In the center of the single large room sat a heavy cast-iron wood stove, its chimney pipe venting cleverly through the rock wall behind the cabin rather than the roof, masking any smoke. To her left, sturdy wooden shelves reached the ceiling. They weren't empty. They were packed with military surplus MREs, meals ready to eat, stacks of bottled water, camping gear, and heavy wool blankets wrapped tightly in vacuum-sealed plastic. Thomas hadn't just built a getaway. He had built a survival bunker. Maeve collapsed onto a heavy wooden cot tucked in the corner. For the first time in 24 hours, the immediate threat of death retreated. She was safe from the storm. She was safe from the cold. And most importantly, she was safe from Richard. She spent the next few hours working methodically. She found a stash of dry cedar kindling beside the stove and a box of waterproof matches. Soon, a small, contained fire crackled to life, radiating glorious heat into the frozen room. She opened one of the MRS, beef stew, and ate it cold, deciding it was the greatest meal she had ever tasted. As the warmth returned to her extremities, exhaustion pulled her under. She wrapped herself in a thick wool blanket and slept for what felt like days. When she finally awoke, sunlight was trying to pierce the grime of the single window. The cabin was warm. Maeve sat up, her mind clearing. The initial shock of finding the cabin was fading, replaced by a burning curiosity. Why did Thomas build this? A man doesn't construct a hidden, reinforced bunker just for weekend fishing trips. She began to search the cabin systematically. She found a kerosene lantern and lit it, illuminating the corners her flashlight had missed. Against the back wall, sitting on a small wooden desk, was an old shortwave ham radio connected to a deep-cycle marine battery. Beside it lay a stack of topographic maps of Oakhaven and the surrounding county. Then she noticed the floor. The floorboards were made of heavy, polished oak, but right beneath the desk, the wood was heavily scratched, as if something heavy had been dragged back and forth repeatedly. Maeve pulled the desk aside. Beneath it lay a faded, woven rug. She rolled the rug back, revealing a distinct square seam in the floorboards. A trapdoor. Embedded flush into the wood was a heavy brass lock. It didn't look old or rusted. It was well oiled. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled over to her trash bag and pulled out Thomas's leather journal. She flipped to the back flap, where she had always noticed a strange, bulky lump glued beneath the leather lining. Taking a hunting knife she had found on the shelves, she carefully slit the lining of the journal. A heavy, intricate brass key slid out into her palm. Her hands trembled as she knelt beside the trapdoor. She inserted the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. She turned it, and with a satisfying, heavy thunk, the internal mechanism released. Maeve hooked her fingers into the recessed handle and pulled upward. A gust of cool, dry air rushed out from the darkness below, carrying the distinct smell of old paper and ozone. She grabbed the kerosene lantern and peered down. A set of concrete stairs descended into a sub-basement. Carefully, she climbed down. The basement was larger than the cabin above. It was lined with concrete blocks and illuminated by a string of battery-powered LED lights, which Maeve easily switched on at the base of the stairs. The room wasn't a living space. It was an office and an evidence room. 3 metal filing cabinets stood against the far wall. In the center was a large corkboard, completely covered in photographs, bank statements, and connecting strings of red yarn. Maeve walked slowly toward the board. The face staring back at her from the center photograph was Richard Harding. She looked at the documents pinned around his face. They were copies of municipal ledgers from the city of Oakhaven, routing numbers for offshore accounts, and photographs of Richard shaking hands with local judges and a prominent real estate developer named Arthur C. Sterling. Thomas Gallagher hadn't been a paranoid, indebted loser. He had been an auditor for the city, and he had stumbled upon a massive embezzlement and extortion ring run by Richard Harding, long before Richard had ever met Maeve's mother. Maeve pulled open the top drawer of the first filing cabinet. It was packed with meticulously organized folders. She pulled out a thick manila envelope, labeled simply, "The Harding Contingency." Inside was a letter addressed to her. "My dearest Maeve," the letter began, the familiar scrawl of her father making her throat tighten. "If you are reading this, I am gone. And it means Richard won. I couldn't go to the local police. He owns them. I built this place to hide the evidence while I tried to contact the federal authorities. But he suspects me. He's circling. I am leaving this trail for you because you are smart, and one day you will be old enough to understand. Richard didn't marry your mother out of love. He married her to get into my house, to search my belongings, to ensure I hadn't left the evidence where it could be found. Maeve's breath hitched. Richard had married Diane just to secure the perimeter. He had endured 8 years of raising Thomas's daughter, just waiting for the day he could legally throw her out into the cold, assuming the secret of Thomas's evidence would die with her. In the bottom drawer, the letter continued, is the original hard drive containing all the digital records and $40,000 in cash I managed to withdraw quietly over the years. Take it. Run. Go to the FBI field office in Seattle. Do not trust anyone in Oakhaven. Maeve dropped the letter. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had been murdered, and the man who had ordered it had spent the last 8 years sleeping down the hall from her, slowly destroying her life, pushing her out the door on her 18th birthday, hoping the streets would finish what he started. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away furiously. The scared, freezing girl who had stumbled into the woods was dead. In her place stood a woman armed with the truth and a burning desire for retribution. Suddenly, a sound shattered the heavy silence of the bunker. It was faint, muffled by the layers of earth and reinforced steel above, but unmistakable. The sharp snap of a dry branch breaking under a heavy boot. Then, the low, guttural growl of a powerful diesel engine idling somewhere near the hidden perimeter of the cabin. Maeve froze, the kerosene lantern casting long, terrifying shadows across the concrete walls. She wasn't alone in the woods. Someone had followed her. Maeve instantly twisted the dial on the kerosene lantern, plunging the subterranean office into absolute, suffocating darkness. She stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, so violently she feared the intruder might hear it through the concrete. Above her, the heavy oak door of the cabin groaned in protest, followed by a loud, splintering crack. Whoever was up there hadn't bothered with the rusted padlock. They had kicked the door clean off its weakened hinges. Heavy, methodical footsteps thudded across the wooden floorboards directly over Maeve's head. Mud and rainwater dripped through the microscopic cracks in the floor, landing with soft plaps on the trap door she had just sealed. She reached up in the pitch black, her trembling fingers finding the cold brass of the trapdoor's internal locking mechanism. She slid the 2 heavy steel deadbolts into place just as a voice echoed through the empty cabin above. Maeve, come on out, sweetheart. It's freezing out here. The voice was terrifyingly familiar. It wasn't Richard. It was a slow, gravelly baritone that Maeve had heard 100 times sipping coffee at the Oakhaven diner. It belonged to Deputy Gregory Hayes, the second-in-command at the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department. He was the officer who had officially signed off on her father's disappearance as a suicide. He was also a frequent guest at Richard's backyard barbecues. Your stepdad is real worried about you, Hayes continued, his boots pacing back and forth. The floorboards creaked menacingly under his weight. Walking out into a storm like this, it's not safe. People go missing in these woods, Maeve, never to be found again. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Richard hadn't just evicted her. He had sent his personal attack dog to make sure she didn't survive the night. He must have realized she took the journal. Maeve backed away from the stairs, her foot brushing against the leg of the desk. She needed to move, but panic was a cold weight in her stomach. She fumbled in her pocket for the small plastic flashlight, clicking it on and covering the lens with her hand, so only a sliver of red-tinted light escaped through her fingers. Above, the scraping of heavy furniture resonated through the ceiling. Haze was tearing the cabin apart. It wouldn't take a seasoned cop long to notice the dragged rug and the scratched floorboards. "Well, well," Haze muttered, his voice suddenly muffled. He was standing directly over the trap door. Thomas always was a paranoid bastard. The doorknob of the trap door rattled fiercely. Then a heavy boot slammed against the wood. The steel deadbolts held, but the wooden frame surrounding them groaned. "Open the door, Maeve!" Haze dropped the friendly uncle facade, his voice turning vicious. "You're trapped in a hole. Open it now, and maybe Richard lets you walk away with a bus ticket out of state. You make me come down there, and I bury you next to your crazy old man." Maeve didn't waste breath replying. She swept her dim flashlight beam across the bunker. Thomas was meticulous. He wouldn't design a fallout shelter with only one point of entry. That was a tomb, not a bunker. She scanned the concrete walls, looking past the corkboard, past the filing cabinets, until her light caught the edge of a heavy corrugated steel grate set low into the back wall, partially obscured by a stack of plastic water jugs. Another violent kick hit the trapdoor above. Dust and tiny shards of wood rained down the stairs. Haze had found a crowbar or a heavy piece of firewood. He was prying the hinges. Maeve threw her trash bag aside. It was too bulky and loud. She lunged for the wooden shelves and grabbed a black, waterproof tactical backpack. Working with frantic, adrenaline-fueled precision, she rushed to the filing cabinet. She pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a heavy, shock-proof Pelican case containing the hard drives, and next to it, 4 thick stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. $40,000. The price of her father's life. She shoved the case, the money, and her father's leather journal into the backpack. She threw in 2 MREs and a heavy metal canteen of water. Bang! The trapdoor splintered. One of the deadbolts sheared through the rotting oak floorboard above. Haze was almost through. Maeve slung the heavy backpack over her shoulders and scrambled toward the corrugated grate. She shoved the water jugs aside. The grate was secured by 4 thick wing nuts. Her fingers were numb and slick with sweat, but she forced them to twist the metal. 1, 2, 3. The trapdoor above gave way with a deafening crash, slamming against the concrete stairs. The blinding beam of a tactical police flashlight cut through the darkness of the basement, sweeping across the room. "Little girl," Haze growled, his heavy boots clanking onto the first concrete step. He drew his service weapon. Maeve violently twisted the final wing nut. She ripped the steel grate away, revealing a dark, narrow drainage pipe lined with ribbed plastic. It was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Without a second thought, she threw herself into the pipe headfirst, dragging herself forward on her elbows, just as Haze reached the bottom of the stairs. "Hey!" Haze barked, his flashlight beam catching her boots as she scrambled into the tunnel. A deafening gunshot rang out in the confined concrete room, the bullet sparking off the steel edge of the grate, missing her leg by inches. Maeve scrambled desperately, the rough plastic tearing at her jacket. The tunnel sloped downward at a sharp angle. She slid, completely out of control, the darkness swallowing her. The tunnel reeked of mildew and wet earth. She could hear Haze cursing loudly behind her. But he was a massive man. There was no way he could fit his shoulders into the narrow escape hatch. She slid for what felt like an eternity, the air growing colder and damper with every second. Finally, the pipe leveled out, and a faint, greyish light appeared ahead. The roar of rushing water filled her ears. Maeve tumbled out of the pipe, landing hard in a patch of wet, freezing mud. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for air. She was standing at the bottom of the deep gorge, right beside the swollen, violent rapids of the Blackwood River. The escape tunnel had bypassed the entire ridge, dumping her nearly half a mile away from the cabin. High above her, on the ridge, She saw the beam of Hayes's flashlight frantically sweeping the tree line. He was searching the upper perimeter, assuming the tunnel let out nearby. He didn't know she was at the bottom of the ravine. Maeve didn't wait to see if he would figure it out. She turned her back to the light, adjusted the heavy straps of the backpack, and began the brutal, freezing trek along the riverbank, putting Oakhaven and her old life behind her forever. The Greyhound bus groaned as it pulled into the Seattle terminal, its air brakes hissing, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the Blackwood Ridge. Maeve had hiked 10 grueling miles along the freezing riverbank to reach a desolate truck stop, using $50 from her father's stash to buy dry clothes and a one-way ticket out of hell. She was battered, exhausted, and running purely on adrenaline, but the black tactical backpack slung over her shoulder held the power to destroy a corrupt empire. Thomas's journal had been explicitly clear. Find Caroline Whitaker, Assistant United States Attorney. She tried to nail Arthur Sterling for racketeering 5 years ago. She's honest. Bring her the ledger. Navigating the towering federal courthouse, Maeve refused to be intimidated by the polished marble or the armed guards. When she finally secured a meeting and sat across from Whitaker, a sharp-eyed prosecutor in a navy suit, flanked by FBI Special Agent David Adler, she didn't hesitate. Maeve unzipped the backpack, sliding the heavy Pelican case and her father's weathered journal across the mahogany table. "My father didn't commit suicide," Maeve stated, her voice devoid of any childhood fear. "He was murdered by my stepfather, Richard Harding. Deputy Hayes covered it up. The unredacted offshore routing numbers and the missing municipal ledgers are right there." Whitaker opened the journal. As she scanned the meticulous handwriting, the attached photographs and the bank slips, the sterile conference room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Whitaker finally looked up, her expression hardening into pure steel. "Agent Adler," she ordered, her tone lethal. "Mirror these drives immediately. Assemble a tactical team. We are taking a trip to Oakhaven." 3 weeks later, the Oakhaven City Hall buzzed with restless energy. Richard Harding stood at the podium during a packed public zoning hearing, charming the crowd as he argued to sell the entirety of Blackwood Ridge to Arthur Sterling's real estate firm. In the front row sat Diane, wearing expensive pearls, her eyes hollow and vacant. "This town needs progress," Richard projected smoothly into the microphone. "We need to look to the future, to security." The heavy double doors of the hall slammed open, the concussive bang silencing the room instantly. Striding down the center aisle was Caroline Whitaker, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal marshals wearing tactical vests, and walking right beside the prosecutor, wearing a sharp, dark coat and her head held high, was Maeve. Richard's practiced smile vanished. He gripped the edges of the podium, the color draining from his face as if he were staring at an apparition. "Richard Harding, Arthur Sterling, Gregory Hayes," Agent Adler's voice boomed. "You are under arrest for racketeering, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit the murder of Thomas Gallagher." Chaos erupted. Marshals tackled a fleeing Sterling into the wooden pews, while Hayes immediately surrendered his weapon under the aim of FBI rifles. Maeve walked straight to the stage, stopping inches from the man who had tormented her for 8 years. Handcuffs clicked sharply around Richard's wrists. "How?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling in absolute disbelief. "I threw you out with nothing." "You threw me into my father's woods," Maeve replied coldly, her words echoing over the live microphone. "That was your fatal mistake." She glanced briefly at Diane, who was weeping silently in the front row, paralyzed by her own complicity. Maeve felt no anger, only profound pity. Turning her back on the wreckage of her past, Maeve walked out of the hall, ready to finally reclaim the life her father had sacrificed everything to protect. Maeve stood on the porch of the house that was rightfully hers. The Oakhaven woods were no longer a place of exile, but a testament to her father's enduring love. Richard was gone, his empire reduced to federal indictments. At 18, she had been thrown into the dark to perish. Instead, she found her roots, unearthed the truth, and built her own unbreakable dawn. She was finally home.